Welcome to Dialogue. Today we're taking a deep dive into a viewpoint that is almost surgically ignored in popular analysis. We're looking at the aftermath of war, but specifically from the perspective of the militarily disadvantaged country. We're talking about the side that loses, but whose loss becomes a permanent condition.
And that is precisely our mission for you today. We're trying to shift the entire perspective, moving away from the victor's conference tables, away from the tactical reviews of global powers, and focusing completely on the country that fought on its own soil and was left with a truly devastating inheritance. The goal here is to move this conversation from abstract geopolitics to ground-level human reality.
Okay, let's unpack that core contrast immediately because it dictates everything that follows. And frankly, it dictates how history gets written. For the powerful nation, the one with the high-tech weapons, the massive supply chains, the enormous budgets war, is almost always framed as a temporary operation.
A deployment.
A deployment, exactly. Or maybe just a very, very expensive budget item that needs to be audited next quarter. The point is, it's an external event. It's something they can schedule, execute, and then most critically, leave behind.
But for the side that ends up structurally losing, the people who are geographically rooted right there in the conflict zone, it is fundamentally different. The war, it stops being an event. It becomes a prolonged condition. It becomes their geography. And this is such a crucial distinction to make. The war isn't just a chapter in some foreign policy paper. It becomes the physical, the topographical, and the existential reality of daily life for decades.
And this devastating inheritance you mentioned, what is it that these populations actually receive? They get the physical ruins, of course, that's obvious. But they also inherit crushing national debt, a collective, deep-seated trauma that runs through every single family, and maybe the greatest historical cruelty of all, a narrative of their own experience that is immediately rebranded and retold by the victor.
There's that cynical observation you see sometimes. The victor writes history.
Right.
The defeated write survival manuals.
That's it. That shift from history to a manual for survival, that's everything.
And we're here to understand what happens when a conflict doesn't really end with a bang. It just sediments. It settles into the very foundation of a society. It hardens, and it becomes the new, inescapable normal.
This is necessary analysis, and we should say it is difficult material, but understanding the sedimentation, this process of permanent structural damage, is really the only way to genuinely understand sources of chronic global instability we see playing out right now. We have to look beyond the ceasefire date. We have to analyze the permanent structures of damage that remain years, sometimes generations later. So let's start with that powerful term you used, war as geography. It's such a clear way to define the difference in experience between, the attacker and the victim. When a powerful nation sees war as a logistical problem, what does it mean for the local population to experience it as a physical geography?
It means the conflict is inherently localized. It's physical, and it is completely inescapable. In these asymmetric conflicts, especially ones involving air superiority, the targeting logic itself shifts. Bombs aren't dropping neatly on isolated military bases. They're dropping where supply lines meet residential areas, where markets operate, where the critical infrastructure is, the things that make daily life possible.
The water treatment plants, the power grid.
Exactly. When the power grid and the primary roads collapse, it's not just a strategic setback for a military. It's the collapse of daily life itself. The war literally redefines the contours and the map of your community, often in just devastating ways.
And that ties into what is maybe the cruelest distinction of all, escapability. The powerful nations in the conflict, they have the political, the military, the financial ability to rotate out of a conflict zone. A soldier, a contractor, they do their tour of duty, they come home, they leave the danger zone behind them.
Right. You might return with trauma, of course, but you return to a physically intact, functioning society. The local population does not have that luxury. You cannot rotate out of your own village. You can't rotate out of the only home your family has ever known. The danger is rooted in the ground beneath your feet.
It's just always there.
Think about Afghanistan, for instance. Entire generations grew up knowing that the sky wasn't a source of rain or sun. It was a source of potential danger. Drones, surveillance, sudden strikes. That is a truly inescapable condition.
So we have to stop thinking about conflict happening in empty fields or on dedicated military bases. Where does this geographically defined war really happen in disadvantaged countries, beyond the obvious targets?
It happens in the places that are essential to civilian to domestic life. War happens in crowded urban markets. It systematically disrupts food supply chains, economic stability. It turns a place of commerce into a place of mortal risk. It happens in schools, in universities. It interrupts the education pipeline and shatters future human capital. But crucially, it happens in the most intimate personal spaces, in kitchens that become unheated or unstocked, and in childhoods where the fear of the next noise completely outweighs any sense of imaginative play.
The destruction of these places is what really transforms the war.
It transforms it from a manageable military operation into a pervasive, constant geographical condition.
And we've seen this geography play out with terrifying consistency across so many modern conflicts. It turns land that was already fragile into utterly unviable space.
Just look at the examples. In Vietnam, the use of chemical agents like Agent Orange didn't just target combatants. It poisoned the physical landscape itself. It made vast areas unfarmable and created generational health crises that are still happening today.
Still today.
In Iraq, the deliberate targeting of the electrical grid, of water sanitation plants, it turned urban centers into public health nightmares. And in regions like Gaza, Yemen, Libya, the conflict becomes total. The distinction between a military target and a critical hospital becomes meaningless in the face of mass bombardment. It becomes a permanent address defined by destruction.
So when a powerful nation frames the conflict as being contained to a foreign region, for the people living there, it's contained to their bedroom, to their local clinic, to their daily walk to find clean water.
It's the difference between seeing conflict on a map of a foreign country and having that map drawn in the rubble right outside your front door. The physical fighting might pause, but the infrastructure war, the lack of clean water, the lack of electricity, the unexploded ordnance under the soil, that continues for generations. It defines the geography long after the troops are gone.
This structural damage brings us to that analytic shorthand that it drives me crazy. The phrase, "they lost the war." It sounds so neat, so finite, like a chess match where the king is overturned and everyone just goes home to reset the board. But that definition of losing is such a profound intellectual shortcut.
It really is. When a powerful nation uses that phrase, they lost the war, what they often really mean is something more like they survived it longer than our political will or our budget allowed, so we had to declare some kind of win and leave. There's a brutal, cynical calculus to that phrasing because the definition of losing is so dramatically different depending on who's doing the counting and what they're counting.
Right. It highlights that brutal asymmetry of investment and cost. Empires, powerful nations, they calculate their loss in billions of dollars, in political embarrassment, in diminished global influence. They reach a point where the conflict is no longer financially expedient, so they declare some form of withdrawal or victory and just move on to the next strategic priority.
But the locals, they calculate their loss in lost relatives, in destroyed heirlooms, in the permanent disappearance of their homes and their livelihoods. The cost is existential. It's permanent and it's non-negotiable. The loss for the disadvantaged country is never a single clean event. It's a permanent absorption of catastrophic structural damage that continues to exact a toll long after the headlines fade.
It's the difference between an expense report and an obituary.
That's a powerful way to put it.
So let's detail that absorbed damage. These populations are forced to permanently integrate four main consequences into their society, four pillars of chronic instability.
The first is the immediate physical infrastructure destruction. We're talking about the systematic removal of the physical capacity to modernize or even just maintain basic health standards. Imagine a capital city where 80% of the roads are impassable, where there is no sewage treatment and the primary water pump has been flattened. That damage is a permanent break on any economic activity.
And the second consequence, the human cost, isn't just about casualties, is it?
No, it's the mass civilian casualties that create these huge, immediate holes in the social fabric and the workforce. And these losses aren't evenly distributed. They often wipe out the educated class, the entrepreneurs, the essential community leaders, leaving behind a much less functional social structure. Third, you see absolute economic collapse, the decimation of local industry, the flight of capital, the loss of access to global markets.
Which then feeds directly into that fourth consequence, profound social fragmentation.
Exactly. When the state and the economy fail to provide, people retreat. They retreat into smaller, more trusted networks. ethnic, religious, tribal affiliations. Social cohesion just fractures, making a unified national recovery and effective governance nearly impossible, because the people just don't believe in the nation-state as a protector or a provider anymore.
And here is the ultimate bitter injustice cycle we really have to emphasize. The country absorbs this unimaginable damage. They carry the burden of the violence, the debt, the ruins.
And then they get blamed for the instability that results from that structural damage.
They get blamed for it.
It is the most brutal irony. They absorb the entirety of the damage, and then external observers who suffered zero physical consequences wonder why they haven't recovered fast enough. Why haven't they built a stable, functional democracy modeled on Western principles? That long-term instability isn't a failure of local character or governance alone. It's a direct, measurable consequence of the structural damage absorbed during the conflict. It's a system that's engineered for failure, and then it's criticized for failing.
Let's address that massive, morally complex gap between the theory of modern conflict and the reality of it. Military theory says we use smart weapons and sophisticated intelligence to achieve surgical precision, to avoid civilian casualties. The theory is that war is highly selective.
The practice, particularly in asymmetric conflicts waged against non-state actors, is that civilians become the operational center of the conflict. The lines between military and civilian space are either intentionally blurred, because combatants use civilian cover, or they're simply destroyed by the sheer overwhelming scale of the bombing. If your objective is to defeat an enemy by dismantling their society's support structure, well, the most effective way to cripple a society isn't just targeting military bunkers, it's making daily functioning life impossible for the entire population.
So we have to look closely at the specific mechanisms that turn civilians into the unintended or perhaps sometimes intentional battleground. It goes beyond just destroying property.
Well, there are three highly effective methods that ensure the civilian population is perpetually targeted. First, you have the consistent, often overwhelming use of airstrikes near residential areas. Even if a strike is precisely aimed at a single alleged combatant, the surrounding community is either decimated or terrified into permanent flight. This achieves the goal of depopulation and disrupting community support networks without ever officially targeting civilian homes.
And the second mechanism is far more insidious because it targets life support systems directly.
Intentional blockades and siege warfare. These are designed to collapse health systems by preventing access to essential medicines, food, clean energy, and fuel. This is a form of warfare where the weapon isn't a missile. It's preventable disease, malnutrition, and dehydration. When you block essential goods, the ability of local hospitals and clinics to function just drops to zero almost instantly.
And the third mechanism is one that powerful nations use constantly because it feels less directly violent than a bomb, but it's just as devastating: sanctions. They're sold as this precise tool of political pressure.
They are anything but precise. Sanctions are often pitched to the global public as surgical strikes against specific leaders or arms dealers. But in reality, they target entire economies and, critically, the central banking system. By cutting off access to the international financial system, sanctions prevent local industries from buying spare parts, from getting raw materials, even from importing basic food. They stop trade. They stifle local production. They starve institutions. This is a relentless form of warfare waged on the economic well-being and therefore the physical health of the general population.
This leads to that cynical calculus that seems to arise in these prolonged conflicts. If the opposing force uses the population as cover, then eventually, by the cold logic of just achieving the objective, the civilian population becomes a hostile operational environment simply by proximity.
Exactly. They are seen as cover, or as a resource for the enemy, or simply as a necessary casualty in achieving a larger goal. It's a mechanism of normalization, the structural devaluing of local lives relative to the military objective. This is what normalizes things like collateral damage reports. The phrase itself implies an accident, but the sheer predictability and scale of the civilian loss suggests it's often an integrated element of the strategy.
And this relentless presence of danger forces a horrifying kind of coerced adaptation onto the population. Children growing up in these zones don't develop resilience in the way we like to think of it, overcoming a crisis. They develop a proficiency in survival. They become fluent, as you said, in a truly brutal curriculum.
They become fluent in the language of weapon sounds.
Mm-hmm.
They can immediately differentiate the threat level of different ordinances, a mortar versus a drone strike, for example. They're fluent in constant power outages, understanding how to navigate life without basic utilities, which becomes the default, not the exception. And they become fluent in what you could call emergency math, rationing food, water, medicine, based on complex risk calculations that no human being should have to perform just to get through the week.
And this isn't resilience.
This isn't innate bravery or inherent strength. It is a sophisticated, deeply ingrained survival behavior enforced by constant existential threat. It's adaptation under coercion.
And that adaptation is just exhausting. It drains the intellectual and emotional capacity you need for any other form of self-improvement or community building.
Completely.
When we talk about trauma, our minds often go straight to the immediate, visible victim, a soldier, a survivor. But it's so clear that war traumatizes entire cultures, entire national mentalities, not just isolated individuals. It's a collective structural injury.
That's because the stress is chronic. It's pervasive, and it's shared across all demographic groups at the same time. It saturates the very air people breathe. It defines social interaction itself. We are talking about the mass wounding of a national psyche.
So what are these common widespread effects that whole populations experience after prolonged conflict? The things that fundamentally alter how a society functions?
Well, the most immediate effect is an overwhelming collective anxiety and chronic distress. A constant low-level feeling that safety is temporary and danger is inevitable, which leads to hypervigilance. Then there's normalized grief. The death of loved ones or neighbors is so common that emotional processing, mourning, it's all stunted. You can't grieve 30 losses in a month, so you numb yourself. And this leads directly to widespread desensitization and fatalism, a belief that the future is entirely beyond your personal or any institutional control.
And this fatalism, it must feed into a pervasive lack of trust.
Crucially, yes, pervasive distrust emerges, both in governing institutions, which are seen as either complicit or totally incapable of protecting citizens, and tragically, in neighbors. Survival often requires hoarding resources, making morally gray decisions, or even betraying community cohesion, and that shatters the bonds necessary for any kind of post-conflict recovery.
You mentioned that cultural context where calm feels suspicious. I find that so illustrative of the psychological shift. When you're used to the noise of violence, the sounds of fighting, the rumble of jet silence often means something terrible has just happened elsewhere, or worse, that danger is approaching unseen.
It means you have to drop your guard. And after years of conditioning where dropping your guard means death, that feels like the most dangerous thing you can possibly do. The baseline for normal is so severely distorted that even when some kind of peace is achieved, the population carries the psychological blueprint of war with them.
And this trauma is so incredibly enduring because the very means to treat it are systematically removed. This is why the trauma is inherited. Can you explain that mechanism of inheritance?
Mental health infrastructure is almost universally the first casualty of conflict and the very last thing to be rebuilt. Mental health systems are destroyed, they're massively underfunded, or they're culturally stigmatized as an unaffordable luxury in a land facing existential shortages of food and water. So when you remove the ability to treat chronic distress, that distress has to manifest in other ways, in psychosomatic illnesses, aggression, deep social withdrawal.
So it doesn't just disappear, it gets encoded into the next generation.
It's passed down to children as a learned generational survival behavior, a set of deeply ingrained anxieties, coping mechanisms, and parenting styles defined by fear. A child learns that instability is the default setting of the universe. For instance, a parent who experienced constant scarcity might pass down hyper-hoarding tendencies or chronic suspicion, not as a conscious lesson, but as a conditioned response to life, which the child then internalizes as normal.
We see the scale of this when we look at specific examples. You mentioned Afghan civilians living under constant drone presence. That persistent low hum of surveillance that creates a unique chronic anxiety known as overhead dread, altering every daily decision, even where they gather for a meal.
Or look at the enduring instability in Iraq. Families were forced to navigate occupation and sectarian violence at the same time. They often had to move homes multiple times just to stay alive, creating an inherited sense of profound rootlessness. These aren't just historical footnotes. They are permanent national scars that redefine public interaction, private emotional life, and ultimately the ability of the society to heal and function coherently.
One of the most heartbreaking consequences of this generational trauma is the way war quietly edits life trajectories, often long after the fighting has stopped. It doesn't just interrupt a childhood, it fundamentally rewrites the curriculum of what it means to exist. It creates generations equipped only for survival, not for prosperity.
Childhood is meant to be a period of stability, exploration, and structured learning, preparing you for a complex global society. In a war zone, that developmental runway is instantly replaced by an immediate high-stakes knowledge transfer, vital purely for survival. Children are forced into an alternative education defined entirely by necessity.
Let's detail that war zone curriculum because it really illustrates the profound loss of human potential.
They learn geography, not from colorful maps, but through military checkpoints and physical barriers, learning which areas are controlled, which are dangerous, where the lines of conflict shift daily. Their world is a map of risk. They learn math through rigorous rationing and shortages, calculating precisely how much food or fuel is needed to survive the week. Every calculation becomes a life-or-death equation based on scarcity.
And their understanding of human interaction, of sociology, is fundamentally altered.
Absolutely. They learn sociology through displacement and refugee camps. They understand human hierarchy, the cruelty of triage, and group dynamics under maximum duress. The lessons they learn are suspicion, resourcefulness, and the prioritization of the immediate family unit above everything else.
That contrast really hits home. Some kids in stable countries are learning multiplication tables,
While others are learning which thickness of concrete wall will stop a piece of shrapnel.
that is the definition of a lost generation, forced to acquire a devastatingly specific and utterly useless education for a peacetime economy.
It is a profound structural loss of intellectual capital, and the long-term impact is catastrophic. The education systems collapse. Teachers flee, schools are destroyed, budgets vanish. And even when schools partially recover, the children who return have been fundamentally altered. Their future possibilities shrink dramatically because of the lost time, the inability to focus due to chronic stress, the learned instability, and the sheer lack of basic skills needed in a stable global economy.
This isn't just theory. We see this tragic generational impact globally. Consider the generations of Afghan children raised amid constant conflict, who never knew a single year without external intervention, and whose education was perpetually interrupted.
Or consider the lasting impact on Vietnamese children and families, where the environmental and health disaster of chemical warfare agents like Agent Orange continues to affect generations through birth defects and illness. It makes a normal, healthy life trajectory nearly impossible. And of course, Iraqi children who came of age first under crushing international sanctions, meaning no proper textbooks or equipment, and then under sustained invasion and internal chaos.
The inheritance isn't opportunity, it's a lack of capacity. The war ensures that future prospects remain stunted because the foundation of learning and psychological safety has been destroyed, and those specialized survival skills, they just don't translate into high-value jobs. We absolutely need to challenge that benign term, collateral damage, when we're discussing economic ruin. It seems clear that destroying infrastructure, the economic machinery of a nation, isn't just an accident of war. It's often a deliberate strategy designed to ensure long-term dependency and control.
When you systematically cripple a nation's ability to generate its own electricity, move its own goods, distribute its own food, or treat its own sick, you create immediate, mandatory, and deep-seated dependency. The goal shifts from defeating the enemy army to ensuring that the defeated country cannot stand on its own feet for decades, making it perpetually reliant on external powers.
What does this economic wreckage look like immediately after the major fighting stops and the country tries to stand up?
It's a vicious economic cocktail. First, immediate mass unemployment, because the factories, businesses, and transport hubs are gone or inaccessible. Second, you have sky-high inflation, often hyperinflation, fueled by a destroyed currency and shortages of every basic necessity. Third, broken roads and utilities that stifle any attempt at local commerce. This environment forces immediate dependency on foreign aid and loans, which locks the defeated country into a structural cycle of indebtedness.
This is where the intentional absurdity of the post-conflict phase really shines through. First, the bombs destroy the factory, the grain silo, and the bank. Then, months later, international economists arrive with clipboards and wonder why there are no jobs and why the inflation rate is 300%.
It perfectly illustrates the self-serving nature of the reconstruction process. The war creates the economic vacuum. It destroys local capacity. The post-war phase then ensures that local capacity is systematically prevented from filling that vacuum, which guarantees reliance on outside help.
So let's follow the money trail. How are sanctions and reconstruction contracts structured to ensure that wealth flows outward and debt flows inward, perfecting this cycle of engineered poverty?
The country is essentially forced to pay for its own destruction. The money rarely stays local to stimulate growth. Reconstruction projects, rebuilding a bridge, restoring an electric grid, setting up a temporary police force, are often managed by massive international contractors, frequently from the victorious or intervening nations. This ensures that the massive revenue flows outward.
So the local people provide the labor, but the profit and the decision-making power just leave the country.
Precisely. Meanwhile, the local government, often a fragile or newly imposed entity, is saddled with massive debt to international institutions to pay for the privilege of rebuilding what was destroyed. And that debt often comes with conditions that mandate free market reforms, privatization, and acceptance of foreign investment, which further opens the country to external control over critical resources like oil or key ports.
So the key takeaway is brutally clear. The country doesn't just lose the war militarily. It inherits the massive, crippling financial bill. It's locked into a long-term economic dependence that is structurally almost impossible to escape. It's poverty intentionally designed into the system. When war becomes an unavoidable, permanent geography and survival becomes entirely personal, people eventually have no choice. They have to leave. Displacement isn't a side effect of prolonged instability, it is the ultimate, inevitable consequence.
And we must urgently reframe how we talk about refugees. The popular media narrative so often portrays them as opportunists, invaders, or economic freeloaders seeking a better life. We have to correct this essential misunderstanding. They're not choosing opportunity, they're fleeing absolute systemic failure.
They aren't seeking opportunity in the way we usually mean it. They represent something much more profound and politically inconvenient for the intervening powers.
They are the export of instability and violence. The war doesn't stay neatly contained within the political borders on a map. The violence, the trauma, the chaos, the economic failure, it migrates with the people forced to flee. They become a living, breathing testament to the unresolved conflict that the international community would much rather forget.
And this creates a unique and devastating double burden for the people fleeing. They carry the profound, chronic trauma of having lived through a war zone, surviving terror and scarcity across international borders.
And then, instead of encountering understanding, support, or recognition of the violence that forced them to flee, they often encounter suspicion, hostility, political resistance and walls in the receiving countries. They are blamed for their own displacement. The trauma doesn't end when they cross the border. Leaving the physical war zone just adds the profound layer of exile, the loss of cultural identity, the struggle to navigate hostile new environments, and the deep, isolating grief for the home they had to abandon.
We see this echoed throughout modern history with devastating consistency. The massive flow of Afghan refugees across Central Asia and into Europe over the last 4 decades, destabilizing multiple surrounding states, or the tragic history of the Vietnamese boat people, and certainly the mass Iraqi displacement following the 2003 invasion, which scattered millions across the Middle East and globally.
These aren't just movements of individuals. They are tectonic shifts in global demographics driven entirely by the collapse of security and economy at home, a systemic failure that the world then struggles to contain. The trauma is not left behind. It is transported and planted in new soil, ready to be inherited by the next generation in exile.
Prolonged, asymmetrical conflict teaches a population a devastatingly simple lesson. Institutions lie, promises expire, and survival is absolutely personal. When the state can't protect you, when the police are corrupt and the military is ineffective or abusive, you stop trusting the state entirely.
This is the social and political consequence of war being waged in markets and schools. When the instruments of governance, the police, the judiciary, the civil service, the hospitals, are either destroyed, co-opted, or actively participating in the violence, they lose all political and moral legitimacy. The state just hollows out, and the result is a massive political and social vacuum.
And vacuums, as we know, are quickly filled, rarely by benevolent forces. What rushes in to fill the void left by lost legitimacy and fractured institutions?
Corruption fills the void, immediately and totally. Since formal national institutions can't provide justice or security or resources, informal networks take over. Warlords, criminal enterprises, sectarian groups, they take over the basic functions of governance. Social cohesion fractures rapidly along ethnic or religious lines, making functional democratic governance impossible because there is no national consensus or shared trust in the state's authority. Everyone just retreats into their smallest survival circle.
This brings us to the profound and intentional irony of wars that are sold as liberation. We hear that phrase constantly when powerful nations intervene. We are bringing freedom. We are liberating the people.
This is the liberation paradox. The core idea of liberation is self-determination and safety. But if that freedom arrives looking like intense fear, if it's delivered through massive destruction, targeted violence, and the creation of sectarian division, it rarely produces lasting, self-sustaining freedom. Instead, it produces deep instability. because the immediate visceral need for physical security overwhelms the abstract political rhetoric of democracy.
You see this so vividly when you look at the outcomes. The shifting tragic status of freedom in Afghanistan post-intervention, where the state immediately collapsed upon foreign withdrawal because its legitimacy was entirely external. The dismantling of the state in Iraq that led to years of chaos and the rise of new internal threats, or the post-intervention chaos that gripped Libya, where the state simply ceased to exist.
The very systems meant to enforce liberation were often the ones that destroy the capacity for self-governance. The local political class is often seen by the people not as a force for freedom, but as collaborators propped up by foreign armies. And that leads to that cynical, self-evident realization. If your liberation requires armed foreign guards to maintain security and order forever, then it wasn't truly liberation at all.
It was simply a regime change.
Followed by structural, financial, and military dependence.
I wonder if there's ever a moment where the powerful nation pauses and asks, if our intervention resulted in a state that is completely reliant on us, did we actually win, or did we just trade one form of control for another?
I think that moment of self-reflection is politically unaffordable. The focus immediately shifts to the next geopolitical threat, leaving the ruins and the structural dependencies to manage themselves, which of course they cannot. The paradox just becomes a cycle of failure.
Within this broad societal trauma and collapse of governance, we have to acknowledge that women experience conflict differently. They often shoulder an expanded, exhausting, and often unrecognized set of roles, both during and after the fighting.
Absolutely. The structure of post-war survival shifts dramatically, and the burden falls disproportionately on women, who must bridge the gap between collapse and subsistence. While men often suffer heavy combat casualties, disability, or displacement that removes them from the economic sphere, the immediate daily need to sustain the family unit falls to women.
Let's detail these expanded roles. This isn't just about making meals. This is about becoming the default infrastructure of a broken society.
Women become the primary caregivers in communities where the health system is decimated and trauma is widespread. They're nursing the injured or managing chronic psychological distress in children and elderly relatives with no medical resources. They also become the unexpected breadwinners in collapsed economies. They're often forced into informal, dangerous, or exploitative labor selling goods on the black market, taking on low-wage contract work, because formal, safe jobs are non-existent.
And their role extends beyond just the household economics into the civic sphere.
They often function as the community anchors. They're tasked with the invisible and arduous labor of rebuilding social fabric, maintaining cultural memory, and navigating the bureaucracy of aid distribution, while everything else around them is falling apart. They're the ones organizing the neighbor-to-neighbor support systems that keep the community from complete atomization.
This means they absorb a far greater share of the emotional, physical, and economic cost of conflict than is usually accounted for in historical or economic narratives. It's the physical exhaustion of constantly searching for clean water, navigating dangerous checkpoints, and the emotional toll of shielding children from terror.
It is the quiet, daily grind of perpetual scarcity management. And we have to be extremely careful with terminology here. It's tempting for outside observers to frame this enormous burden as empowerment. Look at how strong and resilient these women are. But the quiet, painful truth is that when men are killed, disabled, or displaced, war doesn't empower women in a positive, chosen sense. It simply forces massive, relentless responsibility and survival onto them, often without any corresponding increase in political power or safety. It is coerced strength born of absolute necessity.
And this forced responsibility often exposes them to increased risks, particularly violence in unstable environments.
Exactly. With the collapse of law and order, women are often left incredibly vulnerable to physical violence, exploitation, and abuse, especially in displacement camps or while trying to access aid. Their capacity for survival is tested daily against increased personal risk, making their roles not just tiring, but fundamentally dangerous.
We've reached the central assertion of this entire deep dive, and it's the most sobering one. For the militarily disadvantaged country that hosted the conflict, there is no such thing as a true post-war phase.
The term post-war implies a defined endpoint, a return to a pre-conflict normality, or at least a stable new chapter of growth and peace. For the losing side, that is a political myth created for external consumption. The reality that replaces the fighting is simply reduced violence, followed by permanent structural consequences, and an overwhelming mountain of bureaucratic paperwork and endless audits.
So the war doesn't disappear, it just changes form. It shifts from visible, kinetic conflict to invisible structural damage.
The war ends, but the consequences get promoted. They transition from immediate battlefield chaos into long-term, entrenched structural problems. The infrastructure damage becomes chronic daily electricity shortages for years. The collective trauma becomes entrenched, generational mental health crises that fuel social dysfunction. Economic collapse becomes generational debt dependency that suffocates any chance of sovereignty.
And that ties back directly to the legacy of Reconstruction that we detailed earlier. The very efforts meant to heal the country often perpetuate its disadvantaged status by locking in external control and debt.
The cycle of structural dependence is brutally efficient. Conflict destroys capacity. Reconstruction efforts are launched, managed by foreign contractors, often from the intervening nations, ensuring skills and revenue flow outward. The local government accrues massive debt to pay those contractors. This cycle leads to long-term dependency on external powers, who now have permanent financial and logistical leverage over the state. It ensures that the country is perpetually tethered to its defeat. It is never allowed to fully regain its economic or political footing.
So if we were to summarize the final tally of this asymmetrical loss, the disadvantaged country doesn't just lose a single battle or a territory. They lose infrastructure capacity for generations. They lose entire generations to trauma and stunted childhoods. They lose political stability. And critically, they lose time. Decades needed to catch up with a world that was never bombed into oblivion.
That is a core difference between the victor and the defeated. The powerful nation chooses its exit, chooses its moment of withdrawal, and walks away. The defeated nation is geographically and economically forced to live in the permanent aftermath. The greatest injustice is that the country that loses the war never truly gets to leave it. So we have to leave you with a provocative thought that builds on everything we've discussed. The concept of victory is profoundly relative, and it depends entirely on the criteria you use. Empires withdraw, and they rebrand their expensive failures as strategy shifts or redeployments. They declare a mission accomplished and move on, mentally and geographically. But the local populations remain perpetually surrounded by the ruins, the untreatable trauma, the debt, and the unresolved loss that the war created. If the goal of stability is paramount, we have to question, whose definition of war's end are we accepting when we discuss global peace and recovery? Is it the withdrawal of foreign forces, or is it the moment the local population can finally cease writing their survival manual?
That deep dive into the structural consequences brings essential clarity to why recovery seems impossible in so many regions. The purpose of this conversation was to provide you with the nuanced insight that explains why certain parts of the world struggle to find stable footing decades after conflicts were officially declared over. It's because the war never truly left them. It just became the new, debilitating normal, the new permanent geography. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation, and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.